G'day IB psychologist. In the previous video, I explained that why studying just the HL extensions I think is a bad idea. Now, I recommend for the essays, you want to choose one of the approaches, biological, cognitive, social, cultural, and become an expert in that approach. And prepare for that for the essays because you're guaranteed one essay question from each of these approaches, right? If you try to study all three to the essay level, right, 2 or 3 studies per topic for all of those, it just becomes way too overwhelming. So when I teach the course, I teach all of the topics and I teach them in enough detail for any student to be able to answer essays, I hope. But then when it comes to exam review, I get my students to specialize. Are you going to be a biological psychologist, a cognitive psychologist, or a socio-cultural psychologist? Knowing that you still have to answer all the short answer question topics, but for the essay, choose one, become an expert. Now, which one to choose to become an expert in? Well, based on my calculations from my studies, my resources, if I was doing the exam, I calculated that if I was higher level, I would need 52 studies in the bio, 49 in cognitive, 47 in socio-cultural. How do I know that? Where did I get that number? When I was writing the IB psychology flashcards, I had to make sure that I had all the right studies to allow all of you using the flashcards to use any approach. And so that comes, all those documents that I made come in the digital support file, so you can look at how I would do the exams if I was taking them. Now, bear in mind, my goal wasn't to see how few studies I could use. My goal was to see what are the best studies to use for each question. The choice here, there are pros and cons. I'm not going to tell you which one you should do, but I will tell you the pros and cons and the things to be careful for each of these approaches for the essay. Biological approach, there's a lot of content. There's a lot of key terms. It's very lopsided. The IB psychology course is very lopsided to the biological approach, especially since they added most of those additional terms, agonist, antagonist, excitatory, inhibitory synapses, neural networks. They added that to the bio approach. Now, the benefit of the biological approach, why I think it can be a more straightforward approach, is that the questions are very predictable. And what you have to explain for each topic is very straightforward and very clear. You're not really going to get any curveball questions in the biological approach. So while there might be more content, it is more predictable to prepare for. Cognitive approach has the luxury of having less content. There's less topics. And so in that regard, it's a little bit more straightforward. However, there's just a couple of possible curveball questions you might be asked. Now, and also, you're required to evaluate theories, which I think are harder to answer. Essays evaluating the dual processing model or discussing reconstructive memory, the schema theory. I think these are quite hard to answer. Working models of memory, right? Contrasting or evaluating models of memory. I think they're quite hard to answer compared to, say, to what extent genes influence behavior or to what extent hormones influence behavior. I think they are easier to write essays on simply because of the critical thinking involved. I think it might be more straightforward in the biological approach compared to, say, evaluating theories. The reason you're studying these theories and these models is because they're really valid and they are tried and true. It's not easy to come up with limitations for these. If it was easy to come up with limitations, if these weren't good models, you wouldn't be learning them. So it's kind of tricky to come up with unique, interesting evaluations for these. So that's the downside to the cognitive approach. So less topics, fewer topics, but writing essays on those topics might be trickier. Now, the social-cultural approach has a similar issue. Fewer topics, but you've got things like social identity theory, social cognitive theory, cultural dimensions. Writing essays on these could be a little bit tricky. Now, the other issue with the social-cultural approach, however, there is less content here, right? There's fewer topics, so that and that requires less study, so could be easier in that regard. But the problem with the social-cultural approach, one thing to look out for is the tricky phrasing, the influences of cultural origins and influences on behavior and attitudes and identity. That they jammed a lot of words into there, so that might be one thing to look out for. And as well with the HL extension on globalization, could be a little bit tricky, right? There's lots of the influence of globalization on individual attitudes, identity, behavior. It's really tough. Cognitive HL extension has the same issue if you look at the emotion and cognition topic. It's possible, not probable, but it's possible that you could get asked a question to discuss the effects of technology on emotion and cognition. Now, that would be a really hard question to ask, but it's a possibility. So I feel like going into the biological approach, if you really work hard and you're willing to do the work, there won't be any surprise questions. Going the cognitive social cultural, there's less topics, so there's a more chance for you to spend more of your energy and become more of an expert in these topics. But I feel like there's a little bit of a risk that you might get asked a curveball question. For example, 2019, they asked, discuss 2 biases in thinking and decision making when the guide clearly stated 1 or more. I mean, that's just some of the curveball questions you might get asked and you have to be ready for. So there it is, right? Which approach to use? Play to your strengths. Which one makes the most sense to you? Right? Biological, lots of content but predictable questions. Cognitive, less content but harder essays to write, I think. Social cultural, some unpredictability in the questions, perhaps might be some curveballs, but less content there as well. So I'll leave it up to you. I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you how to approach this. I don't think that would be wise. Play to your strengths. Are you a biological psychologist, a cognitive psychologist, or a social cultural psychologist? All right, I hope that was helpful. Best of luck.